As the recent attacks in Paris and the thwarted threat against our own capital have made painfully clear, domestic terror attacks remain a continuing threat, and that time is not on our side. In this country, the attacks of September 11th were a catalyst for major reforms to the organizations responsible for ensuring the security of our homeland. While these reforms brought on important changes that increased our safety and security, we cannot stop there. The constantly evolving threat of domestic terrorism requires that we should always be looking for ways to improve efficiency and effectiveness of our own security apparatus. Our public leaders have said it is not a matter of if, but when our nation will confront another attack. We undertook this project and are here today to share with you our recommendations for improving the domestic security enterprise. The intent and spirit behind our suggestions are to build on the momentum of changes our public leaders have largely pursued and are underway. In fact, all of the agencies examined by this report are not just maintaining the status quo. Each one, from the Department of Homeland Security to the Federal Bureau of Investigation to the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, is led by individuals who are forward-thinking, appreciative of the changing nature of the threats, and who have demonstrated the utmost leadership and dedication to keeping our nation safe. The FBI, for example, and I should acknowledge the presence of Assistant Director Kelly Sleeper this morning. Thank you for joining us, Terry. Has instituted a series of innovative and encouraging changes, such as the creation of the Independent Intelligence Branch and National Mission Cell, which will help to better discern the diverse array of threats and integrate intelligence throughout all of the Bureau's activities. This progress is reflected in all the agencies examined in our report, and it is the public who will be the ultimate beneficiaries of their success. As most of you know, BENS is an organization that draws on the experience and expertise of some of the nation's most successful business leaders with considerable experience in constantly examining their own organizations for new opportunities to improve efficiency and effectiveness. For this project, a team of New York-based members lent their invaluable experience in the private sector to conduct this study and examine the nation's domestic security posture. At their own expense and on their own time, these members traveled all over the country, meeting with law enforcement, public safety, and intelligence officials, poring over countless reports, studies, and after-action reviews, and worked tirelessly to draft, edit, and finalize our report. Our members are here with us today. They collectively represent nearly 100 years of BENS membership, and I'm glad to introduce them in the work they helped to craft. They are Stephen Shapiro to my far right, Tom Barron, Alan Silberstein, and Jonathan Lewis at your front left. To you four, thank you. Your dedicated leadership and commitment were instrumental in producing the report we are about to release today. BENS would also like to thank all those individuals who met with our research team, offered their insights and their counsel through the course of the project, and helped edit and enhance the report. The product of our study could not have been completed without numerous individuals in government, the private sector, and in nonprofit organizations who dedicated their time and talent to reviewing, informing, and enriching our report. This includes members of the Department of Homeland Security, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Department of Justice, the White House, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and numerous state and local law enforcement and public safety officials, one of whom, Commissioner Ed Davis, is to my far left. To all of you, we say thank you. In addition, ladies and gentlemen, to the work of our members, BENS convened a distinguished panel of current and former high-level officials from the federal, state, and local levels. And as well as they are well-noted subject matter experts, including Secretary Chertoff to my left, Director Steve McCraw from Texas, Mike Leiter, Juan Zarate, Mike Allen, Brian Michael Jenkins to my right, and of course Ed Davis I mentioned earlier, just to name a few. The panelists reviewed our members' research and identified the most salient and actionable recommendations to improve efficiency and effectiveness of our domestic counterterrorism efforts. Today marks the beginning of our campaign for implementation. For those who know us, BENS is not a think tank. We are a do tank. We will travel across the country to educate our members on the recommendations that we present to you today and urge their support and further discussion with their business associates, stakeholders, and decision makers. Several distinguished representatives from our practitioners panel are here with me to discuss the recommendations and answer any questions that you may have. But please allow me to begin with a brief overview of our 10 recommendations. Our first recommendation is that in high-threat urban areas, the federal domestic intelligence entities most relevant to the specific threats in that region should co-locate to the extent possible with state fusion centers, creating larger, better staffed and trained, federally assisted, integrated fusion centers. These centers would maximize the speed and efficiency of responses to terrorist and national security threats and create cost savings by reducing overhead and duplicative support services. These integrated fusion centers would improve the flow of information by providing a single point of contact for federal, state, and local law enforcement, as well as private sector partners, to receive, analyze, and disseminate domestic counterterrorism information. Our second recommendation is that the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Forces should be directed by the Bureau to first notify in real time their state and local partners of the status of current terrorism cases within the jurisdiction of those partners. And second, pursuant to the guidance and review of the Department of Justice, create investigative review groups within their jurisdictions with key state and local leadership. These review groups would discuss all JTTF cases and, importantly, convey information on closed cases to state and local leadership so that they may, if they choose, continue investigations consistent with their authorities, independent of federal involvement. Our third recommendation is that with the guidance of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence and consultation with Homeland Security's Office of Intelligence and Analysis, the FBI should determine and apply standardized training and for all domestic counterterrorism analysts and make such training available to all appropriate state and local law enforcement officers. DHS should continue to promote and seek to make sustainable the terrorism liaison officer and priority countering violent extremism programs. Finally, the OD&I should place greater emphasis on increasing the jointness and the availability of joint assignments for federal, state, and local officials, as well as among non-intelligence community agencies such as Customs and Border Protection. Our fourth recommendation is that federal, state, and local agencies particularly operational elements of the FBI, DHS, and state fusion centers, should continue to enhance the career path of intelligence analysts to ensure the desirability of their career choice and to aid in retention. This should include additional opportunities for intelligence analysts at all levels of government to assume supportive and substantive leadership roles, both in the field and at headquarters. For implementation of this recommendation, ODNI, the FBI, DHS, and state and local leadership should continue to develop and implement personnel policies that encourage the recruitment, retention of, and provide leadership opportunities for these domestic intelligence analysts. Our fifth recommendation is that the Director of National Intelligence should appoint a deputy-level officer to lead the federal domestic intelligence effort. This position would have responsibility for the following: managing and coordinating the programmatic, note I did not say operational aspects of domestic intelligence collection, directing the annual domestic threat assessment that I will introduce in a moment, determining and resulting collection priorities, budgeting, and resource allocation required to support these priorities, overseeing domestic intelligence analysis and dissemination, and in constant consultation with the National Fusion Center Association, that individual should establish a uniform set of performance metrics, as well as governance and interoperability standards for the newly formed integrated fusion centers. Additionally, we recommend that the ODNI's domestic representatives be selected from the agency most appropriate to the threat matrix in the domestic representative's area of responsibility. For example, the domestic DNI representative would be selected from the FBI when counterterrorism or weapons of mass destruction are considered the paramount threats, from the DEA when international drug cartels are at the top of the threat matrix, or from DHS, Customs and Border Patrol and Protection when the threat is primarily border penetration. Also of note, this office must also include a dedicated subject matter expert on privacy and civil liberties, reinforcing the established roles of the executive, legislative, and judicial branches in balancing the imperative for public safety with concerns for abuse of civil liberties. Our sixth recommendation is one that of the principal responsibilities of this new deputy-level officer at ODNI must be to lead an interagency assessment of U.S. domestic security threats and intelligence needs. This assessment would form the basis for establishing information collection priorities, budget requirements, and resource management strategies. The annual domestic threat framework should be performed in conjunction with the director of the National Counterterrorism Center, or NCTC, the executive assistant director of the FBI's intelligence branch, and with input from the integrated fusion centers and other federal domestic intelligence agencies as appropriate. It should also incorporate the National Intelligence Manager for the Western Hemisphere and Homeland's current efforts to create a common interagency threat criteria and the FBI's threat review and prioritization process. Our seventh recommendation is that the intelligence community should formally include those domestic security entities performing domestic intelligence work but which are not now part of the community, specifically Customs and Border Protection Office of Intelligence and Operation Coordination, Immigrations and Customs Enforcement Office of Intelligence, U.S. Secret Service Protective Intelligence and Assessment Division, U.S. Customs and Immigration Service Intelligence Branch, and the Transportation Security Administration Office of Intelligence. This would allow for better budget and management coordination of all the domestic intelligence efforts pursuant to the priorities determined by the annual domestic threat framework I just discussed. Our 8th recommendation is that in order to further enhance the FBI's ability to perform as the lead federal domestic counterterrorism agency, the FBI Executive Assistant Director for Intelligence, or possibly the Executive Assistant Director for National Security as determined by Director Comey, should have a reporting relationship with the ODNI for federal intelligence community priorities and management purposes, while preserving its direct report to the FBI Director for operational law enforcement activities. The FBI should also continue to enhance internal recruitment, training, and talent management programs to advance the intelligence-driven culture, all created within the context of an integrated and standardized domestic intelligence community. Our 9th recommendation is that the Department of Homeland Security Office of Intelligence and Analysis missions be refocused on the intelligence derived from the unique knowledge and capabilities of DHS components. This refocused mission would include critical infrastructure protection, border and transportation security, aggregation of intelligence derived from DHS component agencies, delivery and receipt of private sector non-investigative warning information, and warning function for DHS leadership and its agencies for its assigned missions. And finally, assistance to the integrated fusion centers pursuant to the guidance of the ODNI, as well as to all crimes, all hazards, state and local fusion centers, especially for countering violent extremism programs. Our 10th and final recommendation is that disparate oversight of domestic intelligence activities should be better focused to provide Congress with a full picture of such activity and its requirements. This will also enhance civil liberties oversight. Therefore, all oversight and budgetary authorization actions for intelligence activities should be consolidated under the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence and the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. Similarly, a separate appropriations subcommittee should also be established in both houses of the Congress, with responsibility for all intelligence activities, foreign and domestic. With the implementation of these 10 recommendations, we believe that the efficiency and effectiveness of the government entities responsible for domestic intelligence can be substantially improved. These changes would create stronger linkages between federal, state, and local levels and enhance clear federal leadership for domestic counterterrorism strategy. Improved oversight and structuring responsibility can also help build public trust that privacy and civil liberties are being protected. Although it is unrealistic to expect that every attack can be prevented, it is vital to improve preparedness for our domestic counterterrorism enterprise, to better ensure domestic security and resiliency in the face of evolving and persistent terrorist threats. The measure of our success, ladies and gentlemen, will be a safer nation. At this point, I'd like to open things up for questions and again introduce our distinguished panel. Former Secretary of Homeland Security Michael Chertoff, former Boston Police Commissioner Ed Davis, and well-known subject matter expert, RAND analyst Brian Michael Jennings, and the task force lead for this work, Stephen Shapiro. Director Steve McCraw had planned to be here with us today, but unfortunately had to cancel due to operational concerns at home. Gentlemen, may I invite each of you to make a opening comment?
Thank you, General Schwartz. It's reasonable for one to ask why, more than 13 years after 9/11, during which the American intelligence community has been repeatedly reviewed and reassembled a number of times, BENS decided to commission yet another look at it. And in part, I think it reflects the fact that collection of intelligence in a democracy isn't easy. This is hard to do, and it creates tensions and requires constant adjustments to get it right. In part, there are some nettlesome issues that constantly need tinkering with. But I think most importantly, it is the fact that the threat has evolved and continues to evolve, so that the threat we face today in the United States is vastly different from the threat we faced in the immediate shadow of 9/11. Indeed, it's dramatically different from what we faced even 3 years ago. If we were to back up to the beginning of 2012, we would have seen in the first year of the Arab Spring popular movements topple strongmen in Tunisia, in Egypt, about to do so in Yemen, with NATO's help, having done so in Libya, and with a growing insurgency in Syria. Bashar Assad's days seem numbered. Osama bin Laden had been killed, Anwar al-Awlaki had been killed. Many of the other al-Qaeda leaders were kept on the run by the threat of drone strikes. And in fact, in 2012, some officials inside government and analysts outside were saying that it is an appropriate time, that we were within sight of a strategic defeat of al-Qaeda, that this was an appropriate time to declare a victory and end the war. Things didn't work out that way. The turbulence caused by the Arab uprisings gave space for some further movements to establish themselves in various places across the Sahara and Sahel in Africa and Sinai, in Syria and elsewhere in the Middle East, in part assisted by the distraction of the security forces in these countries that went through the Arab Spring, in part fueled by weapons coming out of Libya. Some of these groups had a jihadist stripe to them, and that enabled al-Qaeda to plant a number of new footholds. In fact, we saw in the last 3 years, we have seen an expansion, an organizational expansion of al-Qaeda and its affiliates. That expansion necessarily brought with it some centrifugal strains. There were divisions within al-Qaeda, and in one case in Syria that had broken out into an open schism between the followers of al-Qaeda and the followers of a former al-Qaeda affiliate, the Islamic State of Iraq and Levant, or the Levant and Syria, ISIL or ISIS, whichever you prefer, and led ultimately to open fighting last year. The open fighting did not prevent ISIS from carrying out a string of victories across western and northern Iraq and subsequently declaring an Islamic State. The declaration of the Islamic State has excited many of this universe of like-minded fanatics and galvanized some of these movements. and has attracted thousands of volunteers who have gone to join either al-Qaeda in Syria, Jabhat al-Nusra, or more of them migrating to join the forces of the Islamic State. Now, these developments abroad, which I have summarized here with breathtaking generalizations, are not simply distant events. These have domestic consequences. And the terrorist threat we face today is a much more diffuse, complex, multidimensional threat. Al-Qaeda remains determined to direct terrorist operations against the far enemy. That's us. It has a growing volume of Western passports and what intelligence are called clean skins to recruit from. And so that's one dimension of the threat. Both al-Qaeda and the Islamic State have called upon their local supporters to join the armed jihad locally if they cannot make it to Syria or Iraq. And so we see a growing threat from so-called homegrown terrorism. A lot of the recent attacks are carried out by, I know the media loves to call them lone wolves. It's a term I despise. I think it romanticizes and aggrandizes them. I mean, some of these attacks can be called jihadist loons. I mean, but with axes and knives and ramming cars into crowds. But as we've seen in Paris recently, these can also be a lot more serious and have lethal result. A third dimension is the mere existence of these, depending on whose numbers you look at 15 to 18,000 foreign fighters, of which anywhere from 2,000 to 3,000 are from the West, that are still with these organizations, and what happens when they come back. Will they plant the seeds of new homegrown terrorist threats? And then we can see potentially combinations of all of these. Now, thus far, I mean, the fact that one is talking about suggesting changes or tinkering with the intelligence apparatus here doesn't mean that it hasn't worked. We've had remarkable success in this country of some since 9/11, according to my count. People's databases will differ a little bit, but out of 44 homegrown jihadist terrorist plots, the FBI and local police departments have managed to uncover and interrupt 40 of those. That's an extraordinary record. But as I say, the threat is changing, and one of the things we're seeing right now in France as they go through this review of how French intelligence, which also is pretty damn good, was not on top of these fellows who had come to the attention of the authorities a number of times over the past 10 years. Why they weren't on top of them? One of the problems is simply volume, that they are dealing with hundreds of people who have gone from France, some of whom have returned, and to keep track of that many people, contrary to what you see on television, it's not a matter of keeping somebody under surveillance. It doesn't mean two guys in a car eating cold pizzas watching someone across the street. This requires volumes of people, trained people, to really do it right. When you're talking about hundreds of people, and you do the numbers, that can very, very quickly exhaust resources. And so one of the things the French are looking at, and it's one of the things that is one of the key themes, I think, in this latest BENS report, is how can we better leverage local law enforcement to work with the federal authorities so that these people don't slip through the net. Another issue that they are struggling with in Europe, and we can watch what they do, and not that it's a lesson for us, but it reflects another theme in the BENS report, and that is the returning fighters. Here, intelligence, again, is going to be the front line of defense, but we're really going to have to be able to look carefully as these people come back in terms of as they come through our borders, land in our airports, the role played by our immigration authorities, by CBP, and in terms of better integrating that information so that we can identify these possible routines. The final thing, I think, which is in part also one of the themes underlying the BENS report, is no one has illusions about this problem going away, either as a general phenomenon or in terms of individuals. Back to these fellows in France, they kept at it for 10 years. One of them even served jail time and came out and continued to be at it. That kind of persistence really raises a concern of how do we deal with this, where it is very, very difficult once these people are on that path. If we can't knock them off that path initially, how do we then deal with them over a period of not just a couple of years, but over potentially a period of decades? So in that sense, I think those are the underlying threats that have led to some of the, in my view, very sound recommendations made by the BENS report.
Right. Thank you so much, Stephen. Your next up, sir.
Thank you, General. I think Brian did a very good job of explaining why the traditional approach to domestic counterterrorism, which is interception abroad, will be less effective in the future, and the pressures on domestic intelligence and domestic interception will be even greater. And we must keep in mind, as Brian said, that intelligence is our single greatest weapon when it comes to fighting terrorism. That said, I would like to take my time to describe what I consider to be the central finding of our work and how it informs our recommendations. And that is that at the federal level, our law enforcement and domestic intelligence agencies operate without an enterprise-wide concept. Domestic intelligence simply does not have a coherent and effective architecture in the way that foreign intelligence does. What BENS does is to bring common sense and a business-style analysis to complex national security problems. So let me make a few analogies here. No large corporation could become successful by operating uncoordinated, disparate, often overlapping, and sometimes even conflicting entities, the way the federal government operates its domestic intelligence entities. And no successful business would run its operations without a leader who establishes a comprehensive strategic vision to provide the basis for its tasks and then the budget to support those tasks. Yet that is what the federal government does with respect to its domestic intelligence activities. Lastly, no well-managed corporate entity could remain well-managed for long without effective and comprehensive oversight. Yet that is the state of affairs with respect to the oversight we provide to the federal government's domestic intelligence activities. Oversight which both the 9/11 Commission and the WMD Commission called dysfunctional. The USG's domestic intelligence efforts, the U.S. government's domestic intelligence efforts, are conducted by a slew of agencies and component agencies, ranging from the FBI, of course, to the Departments of Energy and Treasury and DEA. Within DHS alone, domestic intelligence activities are conducted by the Coast Guard, the TSA, Customs and Border Protection, Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, the U.S. Customs and Immigration Service, and the U.S. Secret Service. All those domestic intelligence entities operate pursuant to varying degrees of overall coordination, and in some cases to none at all. Some of those entities, as Nordy said, are not even part of the intelligence community, even though they perform domestic intelligence activities. And this is largely because there is no central leader providing a unified strategic vision pursuant to a comprehensive view of the threat matrix and leading to a coherent plan for roles and missions and a follow-on comprehensive budget to support those missions, even though the DNI is charged with managing the entire intelligence community, not just the foreign piece of it. Lastly, the absence of a unified strategic analysis leading to that unified mission, budgeting, and resource management means that the oversight provided by the Congress, fractured as it is through an array of committees, both on the oversight side and on the appropriation side, many of which are not even intelligence committees, virtually ensures that the endeavors they seek to oversee will themselves remain fractured. This is no way to run a railroad, nor an intelligence enterprise. Does it matter? Well, yes, it does. In a nutshell, this critical shortcoming impedes the federal government's ability to optimally conduct domestic intelligence activities in support of counterterrorism and related national missions, to fully support and integrate the 800,000 state and local law enforcement officers into the national domestic intelligence effort, and to provide effective oversight of all these activities. And one must not forget that effective oversight is the key to protecting civil liberties. Secretary Chertoff will explain the need for a Deputy Director of National Intelligence who can bring a laser-like focus on the management of the federal government's domestic intelligence activities, and it is in this context that I add the critical missing element, unity of effort and strategic vision, which are now lacking, as I've described. Hence, our recommendations for the creation of an annual domestic threat assessment, which would then support a unified strategic set of missions, a holistic budget across the Intelligence Board to support those missions, and which can be managed and measured, and importantly, all of which can then be handed up to the Congress as a coherent whole, thereby enabling it to better view, comprehend, and oversee a unified enterprise, determine its efficacy, and ensure its compliance with constitutional protections. That is also the reason we recommend that the definition of the intelligence community be properly defined to include and not exclude all the entities performing intelligence work, most specifically those doing domestic intelligence activities, which are now excluded from the definition, and General Schwartz listed those. And importantly, to include their budgets to the extent possible within the National Intelligence Program, which itself is put together, managed, or molded by the Director of National Intelligence. Including all the intelligence entities within the defined IC and their budgets within the NIP would enable the ODNI, the office in fact tasked with managing the entire intelligence community, to in fact manage and coordinate not only the foreign piece of that, but also the domestic portion of that, thus creating the necessary enterprise-wide architecture I said earlier was missing, but is critical. Through these few recommendations that General Schwartz described, performing the annual domestic threat assessment, enabling missions to be matched to the threat, and then producing a holistic and comprehensive domestic intelligence budget to support those missions, all managed and led by an ODNI who already has this function in statute, and overseen by the few committees in Congress with an expertise to do so. We believe that strategic vision, unity, and coherence of the U.S. government's effort, and ultimately a more effective and in fact safer, in connection with civil liberties, domestic intelligence architecture can be established. In this way, we can develop a comprehensive and effective full-field leadership of the USG's domestic intelligence activities, which we believe are crucial to countering the dramatically changed domestic terrorist threat. And that's how you run a railroad. Thank you, General.
Mr. Secretary.
Thank you. Thank you, General, and thanks to the members of the task force for their hard work in putting together this set of proposals. You've had a pretty comprehensive view of what the current domestic threat environment is, and both the General and Steve have taken you through the report. I'm going to drill down just on a couple of things, which I think are really important in terms of the strategic guidance that is necessary to deal with domestic intelligence. You know, the problem we face is in the American tradition, the phrase domestic intelligence makes a lot of people get nervous. On the other hand, we live in an environment now where you can't pretend that the issues of terrorism and national security are all overseas, and here at home we're just dealing with garden variety criminal activity. And a illustration of how that plays out, or how it can play out, is obviously the events of what have been going on in Europe over the last couple of weeks. So the question is how, bearing in mind the kind of distinctive legal and policy elements that govern the way we conduct ourselves within the United States, how we have an effective ability to take all the elements of power that apply to domestic intelligence and coordinate them and develop a strategy in a way that doesn't undermine our Constitution, but that allows us to really get the full value of all the operating elements. And of course, in a federal country, that's not only the elements of the federal government, but it's the elements of state and local as well. Now, I want to emphasize the report respects and acknowledges and does not disturb the operational command and control of the individual elements of the federal, state, and local government. What it does try to do is bring together a coordinated and strategic application of those operational elements so that we can detect and respond to threats before they materialize and become active and devastating. Two parts of that I'm just going to spend a moment or two on. One is the idea of having the ODNI have a deputy-level individual executive responsible for dealing with domestic intelligence on an enterprise basis. And what that means in practical sense is, first of all, developing in consultation with obviously the various constituents of the community, what are the programs for domestic intelligence that we need? What are the threats that we're facing? How are we going to collect intelligence and disseminate it? What are the ways in which we're going to deal with these issues? This not only has an impact in terms of the operational performance of the elements of the community, but it also is important in terms of preserving civil liberties. We have to make decisions about what do we want to do, what do we not want to do, and we've got to own those decisions. What we can't do is what we have unfortunately done in the past, which is say don't do anything, then when a bad thing happens go, why didn't you do something? Then after we do it and we're successful, people go, why did you go and do that in the first place? So we need to have ownership and strategy up front so members of the community understand what is in bounds, what are out of bounds, what are the consequences we're prepared to accept, and then we stand behind those. I think excuse me, I think an ODNI deputy would have the ability not only to set programs, but to explain requirements, to coordinate and eliminate duplication, importantly, to develop a set of metrics and measurements that will allow not just federal agencies, but state and local agencies. I was Secretary of DHS when we were just beginning to roll out fusion centers, and there are a wide variety of different flavors across the country. What we need to begin to do is to pull together the best of what we've learned and deploy it in an organized and coordinated way. Not everybody has to have their own fusion center. In fact, the value of fusion centers and fusing in general comes when you can scale them. And the way to scale them is to bring together the elements that contribute intelligence at the federal, state, and local level, have them either statewide or even regionally based, because the terrorists don't necessarily conform themselves to state borders or jurisdictions, and then be able in real time, again, to share and proceed to collect information as is relevant to the particular integrated area we're dealing with. In the case of certain cities, like New York and Los Angeles, that's probably going to be a metropolitan or even a broader area. In other parts of the country, it may be regionally based, involving multiple states, again, depending on the nature of the population spread and density and what some of the target sets might be. But the key is to bring together, as much as possible, all of the hands that have to collect, analyze, and disseminate intelligence, and to do it in a way that, again, comports with the strategic vision that the ODNI deputy should be setting in consultation with the various members of the community. I think with this kind of coordinated effort, particularly in a time of budgetary constraint, we have the ability to get unity of effort with efficient use of federal resources and state and local resources, and in a way that doesn't run the risk of inadvertently trenching on values or liberties that we hold as being very important in our country. So I think this is a great roadmap. I don't underestimate the bureaucratic difficulties of getting this to happen. But I will also say, honestly, I don't think what's being proposed here is a radical reshuffling of the boxes, but it's really taking the boxes that exist and trying to find ways to get a combined strategy and effort that will allow each of the constituent members of the community to execute their functions in a way that doesn't duplicate and actually maximizes efficiency. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Commissioner?
Good morning, General. Thank you so much, and thanks to the board for allowing me to be part of this important study. I was a police officer for 35 years, so I bring decades of experience to this, and I've personally witnessed the evolution of the intelligence process in the United States, and I want to talk a little bit about that. There's three issues I want to discuss, but you should know I'm here because of two experiences that I had. Just after 9/11, I was at the World Trade Center on the pile in the company of 5 FBI agents who were unearthing the bodies of 6 firefighters in a stairwell, and I saw that happen. And years later, I stood on Boylston Street and saw the aftermath of the marathon attack, and saw the body of 8-year-old Martin Richard on the ground. And so what we're talking about is high-level concepts and philosophical approaches to something that to me is a very visceral, real experience. Terrorism is real to me. It's not a concept. It's something that I've experienced. That's why I'm here, and I think this is so important. A dispassionate, objective review of the progress that we've made. And quite frankly, the progress has been stunning. Right after 9/11, I met with Director Mueller and a group of police chiefs, and we talked about engaging local and state officers more in the process, that we could be a force multiplier for this threat that we were facing. And he did a tremendous job in setting up joint terrorism task forces. I've participated in those from the perch of 2 different police agencies, and they worked really, really well. And we became full partners in this threat that we have against terrorism. But I also know that the threat has evolved, and we see fairly sophisticated attacks like we saw in Boston and like we've just seen in Paris. And then they also run the gamut to this Zale Thompson in New York City, who quite frankly was kind of a nutty guy that people knew from the neighborhood, okay? And so if the threat is that widespread, the intelligence that's garnered by just regular police operations on the street become critical to the overall threat picture. And so what this report does, and what I think is the most important component of what we've talked about, the combination of the intelligence function into regional fusion centers with people from all 3 levels of government sitting at the table creates an alignment between the threat that we're facing, the intelligence process that's needed to address that threat, and the ultimate investigative resources that should be assigned to it. And it streamlines the process in a way that's an improvement on the great things that have already been done. I had a chance to talk to Director Comey after the Boston attacks, and there's been a lot of work done in some of the things that were mentioned in this report that have been solved by the work that the director has done. And I think that a lot of this stuff is very much in progress. But you know, stepping back and looking at things as this threat evolves, I think is extremely important, and I think that that's what's been accomplished in this report today. The investigative assets of police on the street directly involved in this process requires that they have information and that they give information. Now, despite the best efforts of every police administrator from the top of the organizations down to the bottom of the organizations, I'll tell you, as a police commissioner, I had trouble getting my homicide guys to talk to my narcotics guys and my gang guys. They all, they all said, well, this is my case. Well, the truth of the matter is, whether you're investigating a homicide or a terrorism case, no, it's not any one personal or any one agency's case. These cases are threats to our collective safety in the United States. These are cases that belong to the country, and we all have to be part of a team that works on it, which with mutual respect and mutual back and forth information. But it's not easy to accomplish, and it requires continual effort, relentless pursuit of changes, and making sure that we're testing those changes. So some type of auditing function needs to happen in local, state, and federal agencies to make sure that people don't go off the path because of, and I know this, organizations have a propensity to snap back to where they were and to stay on that and to maintain that change and to maintain the safety of our nation. We need to be relentless in the pursuit of that. The other thing I wanted to mention is the importance of training. Training really does build a mutual body of knowledge, but it also creates respect among the people that are in the classes together. The best training I had in the 35 years I've been in the department has been out at Quantico at the FBI, where I've had a chance to meet colleagues from across the nation and people from the Bureau who have a mutual mission. And so that really needs to be expanded. The FBI has a training process for police who are task force officers. They have a training process for heads of agencies, police chiefs, and promising upcoming lieutenants, captains, in agencies called the National Academy. They also train civilians. They train some of our analysts who have gone down to Quantico for training. But those programs need to be broader. They need to have more resources to do this effectively nationwide. There should be one standard procedure on intelligence gathering. We were out of the intelligence business after the 60s and 70s in local policing. And then after 9/11, we were thrown back into it. But because of the nature of our disparate police agencies, everybody does it a little differently. And so guidance and training from a central authority that says this is a best practice and you should stay away from that will prevent scandals down the road. We need that to happen. And then finally, I've lost some gems, some people who are vital in this challenge that we have as a nation. They're civilian crime analysts and intelligence analysts who have left their positions in the Boston Police Department because there is no career path for them. There are no options for them to get into leadership positions because the leadership positions are held largely by sworn officers at the local, state, and federal level. And so better training and a recognition that this is a vital interest of the United States government that requires a career path and training that offers professionals options to improve their positions and to move up from the line level analytical positions that they have into positions of leadership really needs to be thought through. So I think that there's nothing in this report that is controversial. I mean, maybe I'm an optimist, but the bottom line is I think that there are some very well-placed suggestions here that will make our nation safer. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. I'd like to open the floor now to questions. If you would, please identify yourself and your affiliation and direct the question to one or more of the panelists. Thank you. Harlan.
I'm Harlan Olin of the BENS Advisory Board. First, I'd like to compliment BENS, Steve, and his group for putting together an exemplary report. And my question really amplifies the point that Steve made about the dysfunctionality of government. After the financial crisis of 2007, 2008, the Fed imposed stress tests on our banks. So I'd like to impose a stress test on the panel. Supposing tomorrow some 24 letter bombs exploded throughout the country, what do you think the reaction would be? And to take this from the hypothetical to the actual, this is what happened in 1919 and 1920, in which members of the Supreme Court, cabinet officials, the Attorney General, other distinguished people were indeed targeted. And the country entered into a panic situation that was amplified by the Red Scare. Tens of thousands were arrested under the Sedition Act that was passed in World War I. Hundreds were deported. Nobody was ever convicted. And one of the results was the establishment of the Bureau of Investigation headed by 25-year-old J. Edgar Hoover. My point is that if something like that reoccurred today, what do you think our reactions would be, and how do we deal with that?
You know, let me begin by saying we actually had something like that. We remember the anthrax attacks of 2001. In some ways, that was more scary because, you know, it raised the possibility of contaminating things even after, you know, the initial impact. And actually, my recollection is that we took it seriously, but we didn't panic. Now, I did get my mail irradiated for years afterwards, and I did tell my kids, don't open the mail at home, let mom and dad do that. But my recollection is that actually, you know, the FBI got involved immediately in investigating it. There were some changes in mail handling at the post office and the postal system, but that the country did not, you know, get into a paroxysm.
I just would amplify, Harlan. My own view is that we are more resilient than we give ourselves credit for. That shouldn't mean that we should be inactive on these matters, but I have more faith personally concerning, you know, mass panic than perhaps others do. But the bottom line is that with bold and appropriate leadership in the circumstances that unfold, that controls the psychology of the body politic.
But Woody, we were all here during the sniper attack
Yeah?
7 or 8 years ago, and this time was a panic.
No, it wasn't.
Oh, yes, it was.
Well, we disagree.
People were very much concerned. I mean,
Well, it did that. I agree with Nordy, actually. And I was involved operationally in all these things, and as well as living here, obviously. And I agree with Nordy. I don't think people were panicked. Did people were they concerned? Yeah. Did they cancel certain, you know, high school sporting events and stuff? Yeah, that happened. But I don't remember the region getting paralyzed or hysterical. I'm with you on that. Yeah.
General, if I might just jump in. I think, Harlan, you might be raising a bigger picture question. Were there a bigger, let's say, another large-scale attack in this country, how would we react? And I'm hopeful that we would not react in the way we did following 9/11 with respect to the institutions that we enabled, enacted, and funded in somewhat of a haphazard and unplanned fashion. Obviously, it's very difficult in times of stress to call up Harvard Business School and lay out a whiteboard and take care of it, but in fact, we do have Harvard Business School sitting here. But the point I'm trying to make is that we've had that experience. We're now trying to roll it back and clean it up and organize it better. So were there to be another major situation, and I'm hopeful that there won't, but obviously, I would hope that we would have learned from our experience and take a more considered, rational, coordinated, coherent approach to what comes next.
I'll go Daniel first, then the Secretary. I'll come to you. Daniel.
Daniel Wallens, BENS member. I'd be curious in terms of consolidating oversight of domestic intelligence. Do you run the risk of creating more bureaucracy? And to Secretary Chertoff, any lessons learned from creation of the Department of Homeland Security with the consolidation of those agencies?
Well, I would say that, you know, anytime you consolidate or make an organizational change, you're going to lose a certain amount of time in the integration. That's true in the private sector, too. I mean, I fly commercial airlines quite a bit. They've had a lot of consolidating over the last couple of years, and to be charitable about it, there's still rough spots in the way that integration has occurred. So it shouldn't surprise us. You get that with government, too. And I do think there's a time when you want to stop rearranging boxes. What I think is useful about this report is it's not suggesting an overhaul so much as an adjustment within the existing structures. And, to come back to Steve's point earlier, I mean, I guess I had the fortune, good or ill, to be operationally involved in each of the things we've talked about, 9/11, the sniper, and anthrax. And, at the time 9/11 came, we had very little experience with any kind of significant terrorist attacks in the United States, any attacks of any kind in the U.S. Pearl Harbor had been the last attack on American soil. It's not surprising to me that there was not a playbook, although there had been some commissions previously that had suggested things which were implemented. And I think in retrospect, if you look back, while the process of kludging together things and reorganizing ourselves, wasn't out of a Harvard Business School text, it actually worked pretty well, and the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Until 2009, we didn't have a successful attack after 9/11 on American soil, and it wasn't for want of people trying to do it. So, again, I'm again with Nordy on this a little bit. I think we underestimate our resiliency and our capability in the face of these kinds of issues.
Secretary Gansler.
Yeah, Jack Gansler, now at the University of Maryland. I was Undersecretary of Defense, so.
Just wait for the microphone 1 second.
I'm sorry. My perspective is much more the current problems of the Defense Department, which is increasing concerns about security with fewer and fewer dollars. And as you pointed out, it's going to cost more money to do more training and to set up these fusion centers. And who pays for it? Federal, state, local. Where does that money come from now, especially in view of what's happening with the defense budget? It's going, down, clearly projected that sequestration takes place, increasingly decreasing.
We met with DNI Clapper just last week, who talked about the effects of sequester and some of the challenges that we face. I think as a nation, we haven't recognized that we are, in fact, at war. In World War II, there was a very clear mandate, and there was leadership, and there was a directive that we had to all pull together to win this, that there was a real threat. And for some reason, we're engaged in this battle that I've seen it happen. We've all seen it happen, but people don't understand that our foes in this battle look at it as a 100-year effort, and it's not something that's going to be over in a couple of weeks. So when we start talking about deployments for a decade, that's exactly what has to happen because of the threat that we're facing.
Let me add something to that, though, and because the difference between now and a World War II analogy is that in World War II, I mean, we even in the darkest moments at the beginning of that conflict, we saw it as a finite undertaking that the United States could make sacrifices and make it through to the end and then breathe a sigh of relief and demobilize. What we face now is quite different in that it is not a finite undertaking, so that whatever we do domestically or abroad in terms of national security has to be sustainable for the long run. And if it's not sustainable, it's simply not going to work. So some of these things that and as Americans, I mean, we think we can, in a sense, substitute investment in muscle and resources to shorten a time frame. And the fact is, it's the time frame that's the given. And the only thing we do by ratcheting up the investment too high is really shortening our own limitations in terms of how long we can last. I mean, as Americans, we still tend to be heavyweight fighters going for a knockout in the second blow, as opposed to ultra-marathon runners going for the long run. But this is a very different kind of a thing.
In the back, please.
Thank you. J.R. Helmick here. Sir, under a best-case scenario, and then your more realistic opinion, assuming that the recommendations were widely accepted by both parties of Congress and had everyone's support, how long do you think it would take to implement them into operation? Best case, and then again, more realistic, if you would, please. Thank you.
And open this up to others, but, you know, ideal circumstances, this is probably a 2-year process.
If I might just elaborate, obviously, some of the recommendations are more easily implementable and can be done with the stroke of a pen. Others are quite complicated. The integrated fusion center process requires some field study, a pilot, et cetera. The appointment of a deputy director level, deputy for domestic intelligence at the ODNI's office could be done when Russ Porter gets back to the office and tells the boss that we ought to do this because those guys were so bloody persuasive. So, Russ, you'll just take care of that, right? On your okay.
It's good to see you, Russ. Thanks for coming. Yes, ma'am.
Linda Millis. I want to say thank you to BENS for doing this report. And I appreciate the persistence of Stephen and Jonathan and Tom and Alan in continuing to looking at domestic intelligence. I think it rivals persistence of ISIS because I know they've been doing this for a long time. And as Secretary Chertoff said, people, you know, used to get an allergic reaction to domestic intelligence, but now, thanks to their persistence, I think the timing is right to have this kind of debate. So my question or my comment for thought is on specifically recommendation number 7, where you suggest where you add additional entities to the intelligence community. A couple of things. One is, I'm not really sure that's a good idea. The DNI has trouble coordinating and managing the 17 he's got, so why does he need more? And then the other thing is, people think that becoming a member of the intelligence community is the end-all, end-all. It isn't. What comes with it is additional oversight and additional authorities that I think in some cases these organizations might say ties their hands. They are able to collect information under authorities as a law enforcement entity that they might not as an intelligence entity. So the question for thought is not necessarily moving people, but I think what needs to be done is a look at the policies and the governance of what do we mean by domestic intelligence reporting and analysis. Because you can't just take Executive Order 12333 and apply it to domestic intelligence. It doesn't work. So we need to take a look at the policies and governance for domestic intelligence outside of moving entities in and out. Just get your thoughts on that.
You want me to just
We have a
respond to
comment here,
Linda,
please.
or Jim is going to respond for us? Good.
Yeah, thank you. Excuse me, Jim Rosenbluth, BENS Advisory Council, and I came out of the intelligence community as Linda did. I'd like to pick up on what Linda did, or Linda just commented, and actually direct this at you, Commissioner Davis. Is there a distinction to be made between intelligence collection domestically and the routine or the normal investigatory processes that support law enforcement? Is there a clear distinction, or is it a very fuzzy one? And if there is a distinction, is there an inherent conflict between those two activities? Because I think that's a really crucial issue that Linda very much got to.
I believe that it's fuzzy right now, and I believe it needs clarity. I think that not everything that comes into the Fusion Center needs to be pushed back out to the street. There's that decision's made every day in the Fusion Center in Boston. But someone needs to be looking at it. Someone that's in the intelligence apparatus that can make that decision as to what should be shared and what shouldn't be shared. And I think that's why co-locating those functions in the same place makes that an easier thing to do. But I think you're also speaking to the intelligence gathering versus enforcement issue. And I've had some experience in the UK that works fairly well there. They have people from MI5 in police departments that are bringing that information out and up. But the arrest function is part of a different group. And so that's a bigger issue that I don't know what the answer is to. But clearly, there has not been a national debate about this. We have been thrust back into the intelligence process, and we are feeling our way around at the local level. And the best guidance that we've had so far is through the Fusion Center and our relationship with the Bureau and you know, sort of following their rules. But we don't have to play by the same rules. And that's a problem nationally.
I think Linda really raises a very subtle and important point, which I have to confess, I mean, I was slightly raised it a little bit earlier in the group too, which is to recognize that some of the agencies at DHS that we were talking about adding have non-intelligence missions in the sense of what we're thinking about with counterterrorism, but are really simple, just the operational intelligence that you need in order to perform a wide variety of functions. So you want to be careful, first of all, that you don't impinge upon the other authorities and limit them. Now, we do have the precedent with Coast Guard. Coast Guard is both a law enforcement agency and is currently a member of the community, and they can do both. And sometimes, in fact, if you're dual-hatted, you actually get a little bit more flexibility. I think on Jim's point, you know, it raised an interesting question that came up when we first looked at fusion centers, which was, is this only about counterterrorism? And again, going back to my experience after 9/11, you know, one of the things we did right away was we looked at crimes that, while in and of themselves are often not particularly, you know, significant crimes, can sometimes be precursors or enablers of terrorism. And the key is, how do you separate the former from the latter? Likewise, there was initially a push in the fusion centers to say, don't look at all crimes. And I think I was ultimately persuaded you actually do want to, because there are categories of crimes, for example, transnational drug trafficking and human trafficking, which again get you very close to terrorism. But I think that comes back to the point we made earlier about the role of the DNI in setting the collection requirements. At some point, a policy decision has to be made. What are things that are of national significance from a domestic intelligence standpoint, and what do we treat as kind of pure law enforcement investigation? And there's not going to be an obvious answer. There's going to have to be a judgment based on resources, tradition, optimal allocation of resources.
And Linda, I would also just add that this is not a simple question. And I agree that that it can cut both ways. But I think, you know, your question at least suggests an acknowledgement that policy and governance for domestic intelligence has not matured. And so I would sort of leave an open question back, unfair, but I'll do it anyway. You know, so who's the quarterback for that? Who is the lead sled dog for that vitally important project? I think we have a suggestion, but I, you know, leave it to you to make the judgment.
Can I add something here? You know, it is a subtle question, but it really points to a broader issue that we may be dealing with in the future. And that is, we, as a complicated government of laws, make and are obliged to make these distinctions as to whether something falls into a criminal category or an intelligence category, the role of this particular agency, that particular agency. Our adversaries don't necessarily respect our bureaucratic boundaries. And we want to be careful that we don't do things that now or in the future lead to situations where we cannot deal with the problem because they have the nerve not to conform to the way we have organized ourselves. I mean, I've been around on this topic a long enough time to know that terrorism itself began as one of those problems in government 40 years ago, where everyone had a piece of the action, no one was in charge, and it was very, very difficult to deal with it. And it wasn't until actually we made our very first primitive step by creating something called the Cabinet Committee to Combat Terrorism that represented the actual first formal federal government recognition that this was something that required some kind of coordination across our lines. We have now devoted so much attention to terrorism and have created this box, in a sense. And in fact, it's worse than that, because our view toward terrorism, it tends to be almost exclusively al-Qaeda centric, that if they don't have a black banner, somehow they're not in the box. So while I agree with you that this does get into the issues of authorities and what your tasks are and jobs are, and we want clarity there, we don't want to reinforce the kinds of things that are going to make us, you know, incapable of dealing with issues now and in the future that don't conform.
And if I could add to that, I think that was very well said, Brian, and if Director McCraw were here today, he would offer up his favorite example of the cartels that affect his state of Texas. And he wants to know, are these guys doing terrorism? Is this a narcotics issue? Is it a human trafficking issue? Is it law enforcement? Should I be approaching this as intel? Just because you have stickers on doors in Washington doesn't mean that I have any ability to stovepipe my response to these threats. So that's a very important point, and I think, Brian, you made that clear. And I think this issue also raises the very difficult concept that we confronted when we began as a task force. When we spoke to people and conducted our interviews, particularly within the intelligence community itself, whenever we used the word intelligence, the folks we were talking to impliedly inserted the word foreign in front of it. And what we were talking about was our vision as neophyte business guys, domestic intelligence. Well, from their perspective, what we meant was law enforcement. And from our perspective, we thought of it as intelligence. It was an intelligence cycle. It was an identification and a collection and an analysis, which is done by law enforcement. So it took, in fact, some hours in personal meetings and some years in terms of discussion to actually indicate or come to an agreement that there is domestic intelligence, which is, in fact, part and parcel of what law enforcement does. So this line is very blurred. You're 100% right to say that what we've got on the books, Linda, is not appropriate for this. And with a little extra time, we could rewrite those executive orders and the statutes, and perhaps we should. But this is extremely complex. And I think that when we started out, and I'll just, in order, even before you came to BENS, we had said that if we achieve nothing other in this project than developing and commencing the public discussion of the concept of domestic intelligence and its value to law enforcement and to the nation, that we will deem that a success. We've obviously come much further than that, but that shows the complexity. Just having the words domestic intelligence spoken without senior leaders going like this, and some of you in the room know who I'm talking about, that we think is an achievement. So this is the most complex of the issues that we struggle with, and we don't have an easy answer. But the fact that we're having this discussion and that we're able to blend, and as Brian points out, don't get stovepiped. As McCraw points out, don't stovepipe me because I got to deal with all these threats at the same time. That's what we're trying to do. And we're calling it what it is. It's domestic intelligence in support of law enforcement.
Yes, please.
Had two questions. One is just when we let Osama bin Laden go back to Afghanistan, instead of capturing him as he was taken out of Sudan, it was because it was said we didn't have enough to hold him. Even though Mary Jo has, I think, properly said if she'd been asked, she would have had plenty in grand jury to warrant his detention on criminal charges. So I'm wondering whether anybody here, since the purpose of a co-location or joint relationships, the end state that's desired is the integration of information. So has the task force given, or will it in the future give, some further thought to amendment of rules of grand jury secrecy and Rule 6E, so that one could, in fact, share with, of course, law enforcement in general, American intelligence in general, but even with foreign intelligence? And my second question is that since other countries are just as stovepiped as we are, if intel has to go up, over, and down again, it doesn't get there, particularly in countries like Germany, where the police function is oftentimes very much at the local level, and federal presence is much thinner. So have you all given thought, or will you give thought in the future, to the idea of foreign, carefully done, foreign co-location?
Say again, foreign?
Foreign co-location.
Foreign co-location, having carefully vetted foreign representatives.
I'll address the first one and perhaps hand off the second to the general who gives us our marching orders. Ruth, it's nice to see you. Good morning. I think that's a perfect project for a SAIS professor of law to undertake in conjunction with BENS in support of this project. And I'm sure there's some SAIS students and old Yale students and City Bar folks who you can enlist. We didn't do that. Obviously, that's out of our scope, and sadly, only one of the four of us is even a lawyer. I mean, so we didn't take that on. But General, the idea of foreign co-location, of course, is a fascinating concept. I think, of course, the FBI has legats, the agency has stuff happening abroad as well, but a more, and even the NYPD, we know through the Police Foundation funds foreign presence. So to the extent that it's being done, it is being done. To the extent that it might be doable more, we have Mr. Sleeper here from the Bureau. Perhaps that's an idea that you want to touch upon sitting there. Would you want to make a mention of whether you think that could be enhanced, whether that would be helpful to enhance? Sure.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah, I would just indicate that that was beyond the scope, certainly, of this effort. And I must say that you know, what occurs in terms of overseas activity is a completely different animal. And I think we properly focused on trying to bring clarity to the domestic issue, and that is one I think we'll continue to devote ourselves to in terms of implementation and follow-up over the next many months. Another question, please. Please, in the back.
Hi, my name is Jeremy Parker. I'm a BENS member. You had discussed framing, just going back to the earlier conversation regarding framing the question of domestic intelligence. Has you know, as part of this work, had you given any thought to just reframing the descriptor from domestic intelligence to something else, or you know, had you given, you know, had you thought about that?
A lot. The reality, yeah.
The title of this report changed 14 times.
Yeah, you know, this is version 14. I would say there's two parts to it. You know, domestic intelligence has overtones that give people the willies, primarily for civil liberties and privacy matters. And we tried a number of different variations. And ultimately, we came down with domestic security as being something that encompassed this part of information sharing and making sure that you know, public safety was the prime imperative. So the short answer is yes, we struggled with this. We recognize that there's a downside. People read things into the terminology domestic intelligence that wasn't intended. But as Stephen suggests, this is something we should get over. Okay? We'll take one more question and then maybe any concluding comments the panelists have, or there's two. We'll do two questions. Sir, right here.
Not really a question as much as a comment.
Okay, go ahead.
Last month, I took part in a conference in Colombia, South America, in which they were trying to integrate the thinking of the country between the Defense Department and the Police Department. It sounds like this is the same kind of thing in a certain sense we're talking about. Obviously, intelligence is a key piece of both of those. And it seems to me that the thinking is evolving towards more of that now, and we want to take advantage of that.
Understood. Sir?
Good morning. My name is Dan Botch. I am a BENS member. As far as my background, I'll give you a little bit on that so you understand the context of the question that I'm asking. The last 25 years of my life have been split almost evenly between working as an analyst within the CIA and since then working in a private company developing SAR initiatives to help build the type of intelligence collection you're talking from the bottom up. In listening to the recommendations, which I think are excellent, it is primarily a top-down approach. It's the role of the ODNI, the role of the National Security Branch and the FBI, bringing together the regional fusion centers, and I do support all of that. And I think that's very much necessary to connect the dots, to do the analysis we have to do, to develop the intelligence we need to develop, and most importantly, to allow for the follow-up we need to break up the organizations that are targeting us. However, all of that is dependent upon Washington very well. I think that requires a bottom-up approach, and what I'm wondering is, in the research that you've done over the last few years, how would you integrate a bottom-up approach with the recommendations that you've laid out this morning? Thank you.
I'd like to, thank you for your question. I'd like to take issue with your description of the approach as top-down, even though it might be that the sexy stuff sounds like it's at the top. In reality, the thrust of this entire work is to support and integrate the state and local forces. So the order of our recommendations, the primacy of our recommendations are, in fact, bottom-up. Even though we're talking about federal assistance, too, we are talking about the effect on the state and local forces. With respect to integrating the private security folks, that's a very important point. We spent perhaps the first 6 or 9 months interviewing a whole host of them. In New York City, of course, they're easy to find. A lot of colleagues of folks like Jim and maybe even yourself are spread out amongst the major corporations and are now serving as private security officers. They gave us their direct input. They were very instrumental, in fact, in hooking us up with fusion centers, and we envisioned that the private sector be deeply integrated into these integrated fusion centers to participate regularly, both for their own benefit and also to feed back, because many of them are, in fact, collectors, as you point out.
Jim, please.
Yeah, I'd like to clarify. Yeah, I'd like to clarify that there actually are currently initiatives that have been advanced by the private sector to collaborate with, cooperate with local law enforcement and federal law enforcement in very specific areas within the United States to leverage the intelligence collection or information collection capabilities of the private sector. I don't really want to go into a lot of detail on that because it's a rather sensitive topic, but there is concern on the part of critical infrastructure owners and operators that a lot of the information that they have at the ground level, on the street level, is not recognized as a valuable resource by government, local, state, and federal. And we have created a number of private-public partnerships, if you will, in different targeted areas around the country where that is being done.
I would just,
There was a last question, I think, in the...
yeah, I'll get it in a minute. As you know, there are industry sector-specific private-public interfaces. And as Jim, you mentioned, they tend to be financial, health, what have you. These are the ISACs and their counterparts. That is an important part of what would occur, I think, in our vision in the integrated fusion centers, that the public-private interface would also occur there, such that the information exchange, again, would be bidirectional. So, last question will be the gentleman in the back.
John Neal with the House Homeland Security Committee. Just had a quick question about policing and the intelligence in general and the culture of law enforcement. As a former law enforcement officer myself, and some of the work we've done looking at the Boston Marathon bombing, talking to intelligence agencies, fusion centers, law enforcement agencies throughout the country. Two words consistently came up, and that was personal relationships and the importance of that in trusting, who you're speaking with, transferring information, and, obviously that's very important for many different reasons. But, for example, with the FBI's mandate of public corruption, it can often cause friction points with local law enforcement, and different friction points that occur when you're putting so much emphasis on personal relationships. Is that something that came up in your discussions and your research, and how to maybe create processes and structures that will complement the value of personal relationships? I know the report has a lot of really interesting thoughts on establishing some processes and instituting some structures that will hopefully grease a more better flow of information that doesn't negate the value of personal relationships, but creates an avenue so that intelligence still gets transferred and we don't have points of failure, based on one or two hostile individuals that may not be getting along as certain.
Right, that's an endemic problem to law enforcement, and it's not just with the public corruption or the civil rights investigators with the Bureau. I have my own internal affairs people that, have that same kind of conflict. People don't talk to each other because of past experiences. Some people are very, very close, and the flow of information is much better among people that have a good relationship. But I think as the head of an agency, you can't just rely on personal connections. They're very effective, but there have to be systemic processes that will make a difference and keep everybody informed. The Fusion Center, the analytical people solved the problem of two detectives not liking each other and telling each other what was going on, because if they're mandated to push all those reports up to the Fusion Center, you've got civilians looking at them, determining who needs to know what, and then sending that information out. And so the old days of just, having a friend, we all have had friends in different agencies, and it's, it was the old way of doing business. But I think that nowadays, it just makes a lot of sense to have an intelligence function that is removed from it, that's not on the front lines of making the arrest or not making the arrest, or running the informant and not running the informant. They're just looking at what's coming in and determining who needs to know what. That's sort of an antiseptic process that cuts out the old-fashioned relationships. Yeah, sneaking around, right?
Yeah, I have to say that our research supports exactly what the Commissioner says, and in fact, I think you've answered your own question. The personal relationship issue was constant throughout, particularly in the early stages of our research, but we found that it occurred by default. That is, it was out of necessity. We often asked the question, and we had a bunch of standard questions, we often asked the question, who do you call, and who do you get calls from? And more often than not, it was my buddy at, or the fellow I trained with, or the guy I used to work with, or whatever. And that's wonderful when it works, but it's terrifically ad hoc and fortuitous, and I don't think we wanted to place our stock in fortuitous activity. So the idea of systematizing that, or greasing the wheels, as you say, is part and parcel of the report. The jointness concept, the Goldwater-Nichols application, where you share billets, where you move to agencies, you even move levels of government, that's all designed to sort of mandate or make this personal relationship stuff happen. And so we wanted to institutionalize it. We understand its value, but you can't rely on an ad hoc communication system to transmit national mission information.
Well said. I'd like to offer the panelists an opportunity for any concluding comments.
Can I just make one comment back to this issue that came up in a couple of the comments on the issue of a law enforcement approach versus what we'll call a wartime approach to dealing with this problem of terrorism. I mean, this is a debate that has gone on for decades, whether we deal with terrorism as a law enforcement issue or as a threat to national security, a wartime issue. And it's not just a difference in vocabulary. Each one of them has fundamental differences and operational differences and consequences. And we do see, in a sense, a kind of infiltration in going in both directions, where we see quasi-judicial processes coming onto the battlefield with some sort of a, quote, legal proceedings, unquote, prior to a targeted killing abroad, or going the other way with assertions of presidential authority as commander-in-chief to detain suspects in the United States without bringing them to a court. So and when we're talking about, I've thought about this a great deal, and I'm still not sure I have it right, but my view with domestic intelligence, which we've already said, look, this is difficult for the American people, understandably, to even accept the notion of domestic intelligence. It's spying on our own citizens. And the way we do it, ultimately, in this country, despite, as I say, some assertions to do it in a very, very different way, is that we ultimately bring those who are identified and who break the law before a court. And so that there is a judicial proceedings, a judge, in some cases a judge, and a jury that act as the ultimate auditor, if you will, of the legitimacy of the intelligence techniques that were involved, whether police undercover, confidential informants, whatever, that brought that individual before the jurisdiction of that court. That due process must be the essential endpoint of domestic intelligence. If we slide away from that incrementally in order to increase efficiencies or because we perceive terrorism as this more warlike threat, then in a sense we imperil what we do in terms of domestic intelligence, and I would go further and say expose the country to, in a sense, incremental tyranny. That is something to me that is so fundamental that ultimately domestic intelligence must lead to a due process judicial outcome that is seen by all to be that. If we put people in dungeons on the basis of domestic intelligence, we're in deep trouble here.
Mr. Secretary, anything to add? Commissioner?
All set.
Stephen?
Needless to say, we'll say, just to sum up, actually to my fellow panelists and to the General and our chair and my task force colleagues, I'm actually encouraged. Even though I opened with somewhat of a negative approach to this, I'm very encouraged because this room itself is an illustration of why I should be. We have Mr. Sleeper here from the Office of Partner Engagement at the Bureau. That's a new position. He gets up in the morning and devotes his time to thinking about and enacting these kinds of processes and structures, and we commend the new director for that fresh thinking. We have Russ Porter, who's in a comparable office at the Director of National Intelligence. They spend their day doing this, and they're open to new ideas, and we commend them for that. We have 3 new chairmen in the Congress, 2 on the Senate side and 1 on the House side with respect to intelligence and homeland security, and there's an opportunity for fresh thinking there. So I think that as a matter of timing, we have a window. I'm encouraged. We have wonderful fresh thinking on the executive side, and I think on the Hill we probably have an opportunity to enter at the ground level with these people. So sometimes you get lucky, and I think we're lucky timing-wise, General, and I want to thank those guys who are doing it for the executive branch, and also thank the panelists for all their good work in putting this forward, and all of you for coming.
I say ditto, and I'll leave this one last thought. One of the things that motivates me in any case is the recognition over the years about the role of government, and a major role of government is to promote public safety. And that is the principal motivation for this effort, was how do we better ensure public safety in an era when the threats are far more complex to deal with than was formerly the case. I think, and I thank my fellow panelists and certainly the task force for your work in pursuing this ideal of public safety. And as the last piece of recognition, I'd like to ask Lauren Badula to stand up. Lauren, you have been the person on the lead for this effort for longer than I have been at BENS. I hope you feel you're proud of this product, because I think everyone in this room is. So Lauren, thank you so very much. And we'll have something else for you to do here shortly. To all of you, thank you for joining us, and join us in moving this project along, of vesting yourselves in those recommendations that you believe in, that you believe are right, and again, posturing our country in a way that promotes the public safety. Thanks very much.